I'm Michelle Foster, I'm the Dean of Melbourne Law School, and it is such a pleasure to warmly welcome you all here to the Law School this evening. I know many of you have been here all day. You've been here as part of the Frontiers in Environmental Law Colloquium, which I understand has had the highest number of attendees ever. So thank you so much for not only participating today but staying on. I promise it'll be worth your while. We've got a wonderful lineup, but I really do appreciate you all being here to support this wonderful initiative. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering this evening on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations colleagues who are joining us. Well, it is an honour to chair this celebratory launch of two books authored by my wonderful colleagues at Melbourne Law School, Rebecca Beck Nelson and Lauren Nishimura. Now, at first glance, these books appear to address distinct challenges. One is focused on climate-driven human mobility, and the other on cumulative environmental harms. Yet they share a deep commitment to reimagining how law can address our most pressing environmental and social challenges by preventing crises rather than merely reactively managing their consequences. Both books urge that we move beyond reactive, fragmented approaches, and they demand integrated anticipatory action. Lauren's book, Climate Change, Human Rights and Adaptive Mobility, anchors discussions of mobility in international legal obligations on adaptation. She argues that states must take concrete measures to prevent forced displacement before it happens, shifting the focus from managing migration after the fact to preventing and enabling it through adaptation. Likewise, Beck's Regulating 1,000 Cuts recognises that cumulative environmental problems cannot be solved through narrow, fragmented laws and individual agencies acting alone. Instead, she argues that addressing these problems involves harnessing broader sets of laws to support clearer goals and better information, intervention and coordination across governments. Together, these works demonstrate that effective governance requires us to think systematically and act collectively. Both authors reveal how existing legal tools, when properly understood and deployed, can be far more powerful than we've recognised. Lauren shows how adaptation obligations in climate treaties, such as the Paris Agreement, can be transformed into concrete legal duties. Likewise, Beck demonstrates how existing laws around the world show diverse ways that legal rules can overcome obstacles to address the slow-motion tragedies of cumulative environmental harm. Both books also speak to equity and justice. Lauren emphasises the duties of developed nations to support vulnerable populations. Beck highlights how legal frameworks can coherently address disproportionate burdens on communities affected by cumulative environmental harm. But these are not pessimistic diagnoses of legal failures, but optimistic blueprints for reform, offering researchers, policymakers and advocates pathways to laws that genuinely protect people and the planet. So tonight, as you can see, we are going to hear from both of these wonderful authors, but we're also really fortunate to be joined by other colleagues, Professor Holley from UNSW and Dr. Tamara from the Trobe, who will engage in parallel conversations about these important books. So the format is going to be that once I finish introducing our speakers, Beck will give us an overview, a short presentation of the book. She'll then be in conversation with Cameron. We'll then hand over to Lauren, who will provide an overview of her book. She'll then be in conversation with Tamara, and we will then have adequate time for an audience Q&A. So please save up your questions throughout the presentations, and then we'll close. Now, I know that all four speakers are well known to you, but I will provide some brief introductions. So Dr. Rebecca Beck Nelson is a professor at the Melbourne Law School. And I just want to emphasise this is a new promotion, so I don't know if this wonderful, so congratulations. And of course also the director of the Melbourne Centre for Law and the Environment. Beck is a past recipient of an ARC Discovery Early Career Researcher Award to support research analysing and evaluating laws that regulate cumulative environmental effects. She holds a Master's and Doctor of the Science of Law from Stanford and a Bachelor of Laws and Environmental Engineering from the University of Melbourne. Dr. Lauren Nishimura is a lecturer at Melbourne Law School and Program Lead of the Law and Litigation Theme at Melbourne Climate Futures. She's a past recipient of a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellowship at Melbourne Law School, and her research, as we know, focuses on international law, human rights, climate adaptation and migration. She received her PhD in law and a master's in international human rights law from the University of Oxford, a JD from Georgetown, and a Bachelor of Arts from Vassar College. Dr. Cameron Holley is a Professor of Environmental Law and Regulation. I'm sorry, how long did congratulate you on it. He is the current Deputy Director of the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response and the former head of the School of Law, Society and Criminology. His research is focused on collaborative governance, enforcement and the integration of regulatory technology in the context of water extraction, coal seam gas, natural resource management and cumulative pollution. He has served as a board member of the National Environmental Law Association and on various advisory boards to federal and state governments regarding the Great Hudson Basin and Great Barrier Reef. So as you can see, an excellent commentator this evening. And finally, Dr. Tamara Wood is a senior lecturer in law at Trobe University and a visiting fellow at the Melbourne Centre, International Refugee Law, UNSW Sydney. Her research spans the fields of international refugee law, regional refugee law with focus on Africa, free movement agreements, complementary pathways to protection, and displacement in the context of natural hazards, disasters, and climate change. She's acted as a consultant and advisor on these topics to UNHCR, IOM, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the World Bank. So again, perfect commentator this evening. So having now introduced our speakers, it really just brings me to introduce our first speaker there. But I just want to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, so just to let you know that that's the case. But thank you once again for being here, and I'll hand over now to Beth. Thanks, Beth.
Okay, many thanks, Michelle, for that introduction. I'd like to join Michelle in acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Before I begin the substance of my talk, I have some thank yous to deliver. Firstly to Michelle, who stepped in at the last minute when Justice Pepper, who was due to chair this session, was held up by some urgent court duties in New South Wales. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you also to Cameron for being my discussant. Cameron and I met in California about 15 years ago when I was a master's student at Stanford and Cameron was on a research trip looking at groundwater. Thank you to my colleagues in this room and also outside this room who have been the most amazing sounding board for years. I think in the case of Lee, possibly decades. Thank you. And my last and most important thank you is to my family. I've heard people say that giving birth to a book is like giving birth to a child. I would observe that the gestational period of my book has been significantly longer than that for a child, and that requires a lot of patience and support and love. So thank you all. So my book focuses on cumulative environmental problems. These are problems that are sneaky, as my slide suggests. So imagine an ecosystem, let's say a wetland. It is impacted by harms from lots of diverse activities causing lots of diverse impacts. Let's say the expansion of a surge of development, like coal seam gas wells over a landscape. That's at the top of the slide. Plus the nibbling away of deforestation of the vegetation around that wetland. Plus damage from invasive species like this feral pig. Plus, add to that the pressure of climate change. All of these impacts aggregate in complicated ways, in ways that are not readily evident to an observer, so they sneak up on us in ways that we don't often realise. The central question of my book is, how can we make laws better equipped to deal with these kinds of cumulative environmental problems? They build up slowly, they're scientifically complex, and they're not always evident to us. So why did I choose to write a book about cumulative environmental problems? Well, as you can see from these pictures, which are travel pictures, I've been fascinated for quite a long time about groundwater law. So groundwater law is really, in Australia, a prominent context that people have discussed cumulative impacts. Because once people start to drill wells or bores into a landscape, they have overlapping effects, and those effects add to each other to create even bigger problems in ways that are really scientifically complex and not evident. I then started to think, well, hang on a second, the idea of cumulative impacts and this kind of problem isn't constrained to just the groundwater situation. So you'll see at the top of this next bank of pictures a polluting power station. So the literature has a lot of discussion in the context of large industrial developments about the need to consider cumulative impacts when you have a development that would trigger a need for environmental impact assessment. So that you're not just considering one development by itself, but taking account of the fact that that development adds harm to lots of pre-existing sources of harm. But the problem of cumulative environmental problems also isn't restricted to that context. We could have river basins that are affected by depletion that accumulates slowly over time until it becomes really serious, or aggregation of different sources of pollution. So all of these situations are cumulative environmental problems, and they have those common characteristics of accumulating slowly in sneaky ways, in scientifically complex ways. And if you think about all of the types of law that we have that deal with these kinds of problems, it starts to be quite an overwhelming picture. So there are separate laws for environmental impact assessment, for pollution, for water allocation, for deforestation. So then the question becomes, we have this huge overwhelming mass of laws to deal with these problems. How do we deal with cumulative environmental problems across these different fields of law, wherever they occur, acknowledging that they are a problem the world over? So my book starts to answer this question first by going to multiple non-legal disciplines, whether it be psychology, cognitive science, environmental impact assessment, public administration, to understand what makes these problems really hard. Because my argument is that we need to structure laws in a way that responds to why they're really hard to address. And some of those important barriers are things like, sometimes there's a lack of clarity about exactly what we're trying to protect and what protection means. Sometimes it's easy to ignore problems that accumulate slowly over time, or where the activities that cause the harm are individually minor and we think we don't need to worry about those, or where the impacts will only manifest far into the future. It can be difficult to allocate responsibility when a problem has lots of different contributors to harm. Who should we point the finger of blame at? That is not a question that is often easily answered. And often these problems are also regulated by multiple levels of government and even multiple agencies within a single level of government. And practically speaking, it's just really hard for lots of agencies and lots of levels of government to coordinate to deal with these problems. So how can law help? My book puts forward a framework of 4 key functions, things that law should do in order to address these kinds of barriers. And I argue that we need systems of laws that do every single one of these 4 things if they're going to be adequate to deal with cumulative environmental problems. In a classic example of an academic acronym, I've made an acronym to fit my 4 key functions. So they are conceptualization, C, information, the I, regulatory intervention, the C, making the circle framework. So what do these things mean? Well, conceptualization is about making sure that the law is very clear on exactly what we're trying to protect, how much we're trying to protect it, where it is, and for whom are we trying to protect it, who benefits from the protection. Information is about ensuring that law just doesn't take the information that's available in the world, but that it provides for, it facilitates gathering and sharing information about the thing that we care about, that we want to protect, activities that affect that thing and their impacts, and the rules themselves. And that might be information that's in a Western scientific tradition, or it might be other more diverse sources of information. Regulatory intervention is then about doing something in response to that information, making sure that the behaviour of actors that cause unacceptable cumulative impacts triggers a legal response. And because by definition, cumulative environmental problems have lots of different people involved, we can't have a one-size-fits-all to the intervention. So we need diverse tools to influence those impacts. And my book puts forward a typology of the different ways that regulatory intervention can target those very different actors. In other words, we can't target the owner of a wood-burning stove that contributes to air pollution in the same way as we would a cattle farmer that contributes to a different form of air pollution in the same way as an industrial development that also contributes to air pollution. The last function is coordination. So we need a system for bringing together governments and communities and stakeholders to do all of these things. And that's a really key piece of this puzzle that, as indicated by these arrows, all of these things need to be mutually supportive and integrated. So for example, conceptualization, who decides, who gets to coordinate and collaborate to decide what we care about and what our legal system and our society wants to protect. We need a link between information and intervention so that if there's evidence that harm is growing to unacceptable levels, we do something about it through our legal system. So the book goes through a series of many examples, so about examples from around 70 jurisdictions in over 50 countries around the world of how these functions actually get performed by laws in reality. And then I have a series of 3 more in-depth case studies that look at how those functions are delivered by really complex suites of laws in practice. And I look at groundwater sustainability in California and the Central Valley, the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, and the protection and restoration of alpine grasslands in South Tyrol in Italy. It's difficult to distill take-home messages from a book that's aspiring to be so broad, but here is my attempt. The takeaway message is we can't take a tunnel vision view of what law can do and the laws that are relevant to dealing with these kinds of problems. We need to take a panoramic view in several ways. I argue that the legal solutions that we can use to deal with cumulative environmental problems emerge through a much wider range of laws that people typically talk about. So rather than cumulative impacts just being part of the discussion about industrial developments and environmental impact assessment, actually there's a huge range of laws that are implicated that can offer us solutions, from product labelling laws to constitutional laws to laws about forestry and fisheries. Second, we need laws to do more things than we typically think about as the job of law. So often, as lawyers in particular, we focus on how law can change people's behaviour, intervention. But I argue that it's absolutely crucial that law performs those other 3 functions as well. Being clear about what we're protecting, conceptualisation, producing the information that's required to structure a response, intervention, and also coordination in bringing people together in an integrated way. We need all of these things. And finally, I think there are enormously valuable insights that we can draw by thinking across different fields of law and across jurisdictions around the world, so that a consumer lawyer in Australia might be able to learn lessons from a fisheries lawyer in Peru. And my intention with the circle framework of functions is that this is sort of a navigational aid for researchers and advocates and governments to address these kinds of problems that share these common characteristics wherever they occur around the world. I'll finish there. Thank you. I think great conversation.
All right. The first thing a good discussant should do is just ask you all to raise your glasses and congratulate Beck on completing the book. That is an achievement. Okay, so Beck has kindly only given us 10 minutes to talk about a 300-page book. And I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit it to 3. And those 3 things are mostly about practice, because the way I read Beck's book was it was aspiring to provide guidance to the regulatory state, to governments, as we've heard. And so I want to drill a little bit into, I'm meant to be talking to you, Beck. I want to drill a little bit into how some of your recommendations and normative approaches to improving how we regulate cumulative environmental problems might work or not in practice, and kind of how you grapple with some of those issues.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So my starting point is a series of steps that Bex sets out in the book, and she is purposefully not prescriptive in saying, design laws this way, or you must enact a piece of legislation that goes like this. Instead, she's encouraging governments or decision makers generally to reflect on things, to follow certain processes, and her preliminary, and for me, the foundational element of a lot of her work, which she reinforced earlier on, is to say, when you are confronted with a cumulative environmental problem, you don't immediately go, I'm going to introduce a new piece of legislation. You must step back and assess the full space, all the laws that are relevant. So to vibe off today's conference, all cumulative environmental problems regulations would be all laws that exist anywhere. The hypothesis would be we must look at all of these laws first. We must work out how they are contributing to the problem or could help solve the particular problem. She also says that we need to consider all the different actors that might be able to have a role or that are having a role to influence that particular cumulative environmental problem. That idea shares resonances with a form of social constructionism in sociology and other ideas that have infiltrated regulation and have become more popular as we face more complex problems. So Earth Systems Law talks about an architecture principle. Colin Scott talked about regulatory space, and I think Fiona Haynes and Christine Parker in their idea of ecological regulation, they have similar kinds of starting points, which is to say, we don't assume things, we must empirically approach this space and consider how we are going to respond. And so my first question to Beck then is to say, my hunch is that is exactly the right idea, but it is really, really hard for governments to have the time and the space and even authorizing environment to be able to sit down and essentially pull themselves out of organizational silos that have been set up within and think across all the different laws that might be in front of them. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but it means it's a difficult idea for governments and regulators to pick up. And I just wanted to, draw you out in how you thought about that particular issue. Is it an ideal that you would like us to aspire to? And what kind of steps you might see governments or researchers taking to help support them improve that kind of practice?
Thanks very much for the question, Cameron. I really agree here with Cameron's intuition that governments, people who work in agencies, don't have a lot of time to prioritise the really deep thinking about how regulatory systems work. So one of the reasons that I decided to become an academic was because, despite the fact that I loved my job as a legal practitioner, there was very little time to do the deep thinking and sort of about the sorts of problems that I saw. So this is absolutely a reality. So I think, though, that it's interesting to pause and think about how is it that we've produced administrative systems where regulators don't have enough time to think about the deep problems that they're trying to address. Sometimes we see that they do, and often it's in response to crisis. So, for example, a royal commission after the Victorian bushfires, or an independent expert panel that looked into the massive fish kills in the Murray-Darling Basin. Those individual catastrophic impacts focus the mind and provide the space to do that deeper thinking. But ideally, of course, we wouldn't wait until there's a catastrophic crisis before we do that deep thinking. And so thinking about where we could find the opportunity to do that, or where there are agencies who are more able to do that than others, I think points us in a few different directions. So one is to have a special purpose agency that is set up to protect a thing that we all know that we care about, that has the legal tools to protect it and the space to think about how best to do that. So one of the chapters in my book talks about the Great Barrier Reef. And there we have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, whose whole job is to protect the Great Barrier Reef. In 2014, it was tasked to undertake what's called a strategic assessment under our national environmental law, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And the point of that exercise was to say, let's do a deep exercise of understanding cumulative impacts on the reef, however they're caused, whether it's by shipping movements or water pollution or climate change. And let's figure out if the management settings and the regulation that we have in place, if it's adequate to the task. Now, it was a crisis situation in that the reason that strategic assessment came about is because the World Heritage Committee requested that Australia undertake that strategic assessment, accompanied by the threat that if things didn't get better, the reef could be listed as World Heritage in danger. So this was a situation of crisis focusing the mind, but there was the institutional setup in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and there was the legal tool in the strategic assessment to respond to that crisis in a really productive way. So that's one setting where we can create the space to kind of do that deeper thinking. Another situation that I think is promising is where there are legislative triggers to review an act. So often in the environmental or natural resources space, every 5 or 10 years, the operation of an act has to be reviewed. So we've just had that with our federal environmental law, with the Samuel review. We will have that shortly with a review of the Water Act. That's an opportunity to slow down and think, is this piece of legislation working? That's positive. The footnote, which is more negative, is that exercise is focused on one piece of legislation, and it doesn't take a bigger picture view of everything that could help reach the objective of the legislation. I was really fortunate last year to be tasked by the Federal Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water to undertake a smaller exercise of that nature to look at how regulation under the EPBC Act could better regulate cumulative impacts of renewable energy projects. They said, tell us how the lessons of your book could be translated into the regulatory space under the EPBC Act. That's a dream question for an academic who has just written a book. What a fantastic task. But again, they're focused quite naturally on the piece of legislation that they administer. Their question is not, how can we regulate through lots of pieces of law and coordination with lots of levels of government and lots of agencies this problem we're concerned about? So there's these footnotes to the ability to think more deeply. I think specialist environmental information organisations can play a role, but ultimately I think civil society and academia have a role to play in advocating for government to do the deep thinking to improve regulation in response to problems that are important. And as academics, we have more mental space to do the sorts of analysis in collaboration with governments where possible to make things better. So all of this is to say, I think it's not easy. I think there are some bright spots in our abilities to do this sort of thinking, but we have to take up the opportunities when they present themselves.
Thank you very much. So the second question is connected to the first. So when you're laying out your principle of being panoramic and casting a wide net and thinking about the various laws, you make various suggestions for the government. So for example, consider rules around sharing information, consider rules about how agencies might collaborate. So not just, as you say, traditionally laws about behaviour. In my reading, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but you kind of stop or bracket the amount of laws that they might need to consider or the regulations they might need to consider implicitly, or maybe silently, because you don't start or encourage them to think about, say, rules around property, rules around markets, rules around political donations and lobbying. And these sorts of questions sometimes pop up in the regulatory space where people are saying that it's actually these other systems that are driving the problems, and we need to fundamentally change the legal structures. And so an example of that might be coal seam gas, which you mentioned earlier. So if we were looking at regulating coal seam gas, a starting point might be to say we need to unwind the fact that governments get royalties from coal seam gas when they are regulating it at the same time. That is a big ask for a government agency or a decision maker to propose to the minister that something like that would happen, and it would be a big challenge for society to deal with kind of the loss of that economic return and other kinds of things. So I just wanted to draw you out a little bit about, we all have to make choices when we're writing, and did you make a choice to kind of bracket those things up? It's not that you don't recognise that they're there, but are they kind of in the too hard basket? Do you see them as something you'll research in the future? Something along those lines.
Thanks, Tamara. So I did make the decision in kind of scoping the book to focus on laws that have as their direct objective, we want to contribute to solving an environmental problem. And already that is a huge array of laws, particularly when you look across jurisdictions. But I think your question kind of gets to how about the laws that influence power? And I think that comes out in some of my case studies in different ways. So if I think about my case study on groundwater sustainability in California, the key piece of legislation that I look at there to explore the function of conceptualization, what are we trying to protect and for whom, the for whom part is where the power element comes in. Because in California, there's this divide between the large irrigators that use very large quantities of groundwater and the communities, often disadvantaged communities, that rely on groundwater for their domestic use, the backyard well. They're typically shallow wells and they're vulnerable to going dry because of the overuse of groundwater by others. And so figuring out who's responsible for conceptualising how much we want to protect groundwater points to the local agencies, the groundwater sustainability agencies, whose job it is to set those targets. Scholars have already established that the way groundwater sustainability agencies are elected, so this points to electoral laws and the power that's involved there, means that those large irrigators have an outsized voice in the agencies. That affects how conceptualization happens, because the agencies set targets in a way that disproportionately protects large irrigators and doesn't provide a whole lot of protection for disadvantaged communities. So it's there in a more subtle way. I do think that you could use the circle framework of 4 functions to ask what are the effects of, say, a law about political donations, if you consider the decisions under that law, or what are the effects of other forms of laws that fall outside kind of directly, laws that are directly aimed at environmental objectives. So I hope that the framework I offer is useful for other researchers and advocates looking at these broader areas of law.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then the final question kind of ties back a little bit to your point about crisis, but I'm going to stop you from talking about that, so you can't mention crisis anymore. This is a question that arises from Beck's very, I think, pragmatic and very real approach to unpacking the challenges of cumulative environmental problems and the likelihood of the circle framework and the case studies leading to rapid change. And essentially, I think I'm reading correctly, you're saying it's going to take time and it might take multiple regulatory reforms to kind of move us through to respond to probably increasingly urgent problems, and climate change is an example of that, obviously. At the end of the book, you ask a question of the readers, and you basically say, where does that leave us if this is going to take a lot of time? And that question's kind of left hanging because it's in the second last paragraph. I love the question, I wanted answers to that question. So my final question to Beck is really her own question, which is to say, where does the circle framework, the documented innovations, and kind of the regulatory scripts and processes you lay out leave us with addressing these problems?
And you have 3 minutes.
You would think, given that I posed the question, that I would have an answer to that question that's more satisfying than what I'm going to say. Look, I think it does take a lot of time. I'm not sure that my intention with the circle framework is to make that quicker, because it just inevitably is such a complex legal space. But my intention is that we don't forget about the things that we could be using. So I hope that, particularly with the last chapter of my book, which is supposed to be a plain English summary as much as a lawyer can accomplish that, for regulators and for advocates, that it be like a checklist, like have I thought about this? Is my law doing this? Do we have a gap here? Is there a weakness we need to think about? That it function as a way to not forget about really important tools, which if we lack them, we will not, I argue, have an adequate framework to deal with these problems. And I think I would love to have this framework used by researchers who also take a problem-driven approach to their work. If they're working in really any field of law that has these problems that have these same characteristics of slow accumulation, complexity, and things that aren't immediately evident, but that are really important for us to address. So I offer the framework as a tool for others to use, and I hope that it's useful in different contexts.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, I would like to also acknowledge that we are on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to say my thank yous as well. First, thank you, Beth, for letting me share the space with you, for celebrating, and for that wonderful conversation. It's a tough act to follow. Thank you to Michelle for stepping in at the last minute and for framing that so wonderfully. And thank you to Tamara for being my discussant, for the conversations we've had, and I'm really looking forward to more of them now and in the future. So my book responds to another environmental problem. So this is the intersection of climate change and mobility I'm going to talk about. And this, of course, raises big policy and legal questions, social and political considerations that are attracting a significant amount of attention. But the book especially responds to one dominant tendency in how its intersection is approached. And I know I forgot to say thank you to my family. Thank you guys so much, my family and friends, for being here and for staying up late past bedtime. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Okay, so as you can see here, I have some headlines. And this is the dominant approach that I'm thinking about, where we see the kind of the dire warnings about climate migration, the mass exodus, the flight of so-called climate refugees. And often this concern, it's well-intentioned, right? And it's not necessarily wrong. So these could come to pass at some point. But the problem is that they consistently create two different kinds of issues. The first is that despite the warnings, despite the language, they actually radically underestimate the scope and the complexity of the problem. So we already have ample research that tells us people will not only be moving en masse, people are not only refugees. In fact, they are and will continue to move within countries. Movement can be more or less voluntary. It can occur rapidly or slowly. It can be temporary or more permanent. And then climate change may also lead to people who are unable or unwilling to move. And then second, this framing narrows the kinds of solutions that we actually talk about in both policy and law. So when we think about migrants or climate change refugees, that necessarily leads us to an intuitive starting point where we're talking about migration law frameworks, right? And what is the role of the refugee law? And those are gonna have important roles, and I'm happy to talk about those more in the question and answer, but they have some significant limitations. So there's been a lot of great work done about the limitations of these approaches, and my book really starts with 4 of them that I emphasize. The first of these is that the frameworks tend to be tied to a category of migrant. So think a refugee or a stateless person. While this is going to apply in the context of climate change, and there will be some people who meet these criteria, most people will not fall into these criteria, especially when they hinge on movement that is forced. Second, frameworks are often reactive, offering legal status and protection only after people have moved or only after they've crossed a border, and can show that they are already experiencing or face very significant harm. Third, there are serious obstacles to international mobility right now. So think about things like detention. We see this in the news right now, borders, fences, pushing people away, right? These things are social and political, even where they involve laws, but they're also baked into international law, in part because there's no general right to enter or stay in another country. And then finally and fundamentally,
these approaches individualize what should be a collective problem. They make legal status and protection contingent on meeting a specific criteria, qualifying as a certain category of migrant, like a refugee, and it asks the individual to navigate these bureaucratic systems for themselves, rather than treating the role of climate change and mobility as an issue that demands collective solutions. So given what we know about climate change, given we know that impacts are occurring, we know solutions that need to be envisioned that do more than just require people to act exclusively as individuals in search of protection that is often ad hoc or too late. Solutions are going to have to be collective, they're going to have to be proactive and anticipatory, and we're going to have to adapt. So my book starts by flipping the conceptual and legal starting point. So rather than looking at migration-focused frameworks as a source of protection for climate mobility, it conceptualizes this as a climate problem. And so it looks to climate law and it looks at this as a climate issue. And then the book does three main things. So first, I look to international climate change regime and to treaties, especially in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And I argue that these treaties contain three identifiable types of obligations on adaptation. The first is an obligation to act on adaptation. The second is an obligation to assist with adaptation. And then the last is to cooperate in adaptation. And these obligations are very broad. So for example, they tell states that they must engage in adaptation planning or implement actions, or that developed countries must provide support for developing countries that are particularly vulnerable and meeting the costs of adaptation, but they lack significant clarity. So second, my book aims to make these adaptation obligations more concrete, and it does that by using the tools of international treaty interpretation. So I integrate relevant rules from human rights law, particularly positive duties from the rights to life, to inadequate food, water, health, and housing. And then I also incorporate the operative or guiding principles that are in the climate treaties, and that includes the principles of precaution, equity, and common but differentiated responsibilities. And together, these principles and these duties from human rights can lead to an understanding of these obligations that would require states to undertake adaptation measures in the face of foreseeable risks to ensure that people have continued access to basic resources like potable water, like food. And there are multiple ways to accomplish this, right? So there can be adaptation measures that focus on infrastructure, there can be changes in agriculture, there can be outright provision of resources. But at some point, I argue, when these measures become insufficient and when resources and rights are no longer accessible, people will need to start thinking about moving, right? And how they do so and the kind of support that is available is critical to the experience of migrants and their families in their home and host communities. So the kind of mobility that the arguments in my book advance requires action before people are unable to access their rights and resources, before they're forced into precarious and irregular movement, and then it instead makes migration part of the process of adaptation. And this is what my book calls anticipatory or adaptive mobility. It's a proactive, anticipatory approach to movement that's rooted in human rights. And then importantly, the book's interpretation would also require that other countries like Australia support and cooperate in these efforts. Then the third thing my book does is illustrate how these interpretations might work in context. So I include 3 case studies that explore what it looks like when states facilitate adaptive mobility, and then what kinds of international assistance and cooperation are happening and might be needed to make this adaptive mobility work. Each of the case studies was also selected to consider different kinds of mobility and different questions that they raise. So the case study of Bangladesh considers internal adaptive mobility in a low-lying country that already has a lot of internal and seasonal migration. The Pacific Island countries often are described as so-called sinking states. But my case study interrogates assumptions that often accompany this, and it explores a tension between the right and choice to stay and the need to start planning for movement, even if it is a last resort. And then the Sahel case study focuses on the role of adaptive mobility in international movement. So it explores the impacts to drylands and how adaptation obligations can lead to facilitation and support of international migration. There's a lot more I could say about this, because I wrote a whole book about it. But I want to end my remarks by returning to some of the limitations that I mentioned at the outset. So to highlight some of the benefits or the advantages of the book's approach. And I think there are 2 kinds of benefits. And the first are those that are actually using climate law itself. So what are the advantages of the climate machine? Unlike migration frameworks, state action is not linked to people falling into a particular category of migrant or establishing the climate change forced people to move. And in fact, it's not even really linked to migration at all, but it's instead looking at addressing foreseeable risks that will lead to movement without action. So this will help prevent displacement and allow for safer migration with legal protection and status. It also brings the issue of mobility into an international regime where there are problems that are requiring collective action now. So where there's responsibility that is shared, cooperation is mandated, and assistance is required. And that brings me to another advantage of the climate regime, and that's that support is a legal obligation. So it's not humanitarian aid we're talking about, it's not facilitating through loans or financing through loans. And these obligations provide a legal basis for arguing that those countries which have contributed the most to climate change must provide funding and support and pay for adaptation in those countries that are facing the brunt of impacts. There are also some advantages of this approach if states implement the obligations in the way that I argued for. And so this would include a wider breadth of action that could be taken. So it opens the door to a range of adaptation measures that include, but are not only planning for and facilitating migration. And relatedly, this makes the timing for that mobility such that action and support comes before people are forced to move, to help prevent displacement and to offer pathways for more adaptive mobility. So I would end my comments there.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And Cameron's given me an excellent lesson in book commentator etiquette, but recognising that some people's glasses may have run dry by now, I think we'll just give a great round of applause and a cheer for Lauren. Similar to the previous conversation, actually, I'd like to begin by drawing you out a little bit more on what this looks like in practice. I think one of the really great things about both of these books is the way that they seek to sort of guide something that's actually practically useful in the world, both by considering what it might look like, by going beyond the law to consider what institutions might look like or infrastructure. And in the case of your book, chapters 7 to 9 give us the 3 really nice case studies. So the small island states, Bangladesh and the Sahel, where you've done a great job of setting out what the impacts of climate change look like, the implications for mobility into the future, and then a discussion of really concrete examples of what some of these countries are doing or could be doing that would sort of implement the core idea of your book, the idea that mobility can be used as a form of adaptation, and it should be approached that way rather than waiting until it becomes a crisis. So I wondered if you could just expand a little bit for us on those case studies and what's actually happening or could be happening on the ground.
Thanks, that's a great question. And I want to make a caveat that I am in no way an expert in these areas for these regions. And in fact, we have people in this room that know a lot more about these areas. So invite them to contribute as well. But if adaptive mobility is the goal, right? This is what I'm looking for. And so my book is structured in a way where I look at the kinds of practices that are happening or that could be happening on the ground by framing them on those 3 obligations. So first I look at what are states doing? How are they acting? What kinds of things are they doing? And you can already see in some of the locations that states are already starting to, for example, plan for and integrate migration into their adaptation plan, right? So Bangladesh is a great example of this, where adaptation and mobility is already in the National Adaptation Plan. There's actually concrete action plans and policies on internal mobility as well that incorporate human rights and incorporate adaptation as a goal. And then the flip side also happens there, which I think is wonderful, is that the migration policies and plans also incorporate climate and adaptation. So that's happening there as well. They also have plans on the ground that are being implemented to make migrant-friendly second cities to relieve some of the pressure in urban areas like Dhaka, for example. Then there are also actions and guidance in terms of planned relocation. So Fiji and the Solomon Islands have guidelines. Fiji has a standard operating procedure, and it's even integrated human rights, Paris Agreement, adaptation, all the things that I'm talking about into its climate legislation. So that's good. There's also, in terms of assistance, a very new thing that's not in the book because it's happened after it. There's the Pacific Resilience Facility, and And this is a regional agreement, and there was actually a treaty that established it, so binding treaty, where Australia is a party. And the purpose of this fund, which is currently raising money, is to make it easier for Pacific countries to access adaptation funding, right? So they don't have to go through these bureaucratic hurdles. And then I think the final thing is cooperation, but assistance and cooperation overlap, right? So we have regional agreements, we have bilateral agreements that are about mobility. We have free movement agreements that are in the Sahel, for example, that can be expanded upon, but there are some challenges. Nearby in the IGAD region, there's actually a protocol on free movement, which explicitly incorporates anticipatory action, so people can move across borders if they're moving in anticipation of harm from climate change. So that's an interesting example as well. I know that you have done a fair amount of work in parts of Africa. I know you've worked in the Pacific, and I know there's examples of the regional framework here. And I guess turn the question back to you and ask if there's anything in these buckets of action or support or assistance that you can think of that are demonstrating these kind of more adaptive frameworks that help people not be displaced.
Thanks, Lauren, and this is such a burgeoning area. You know, if you'd asked me when I first entered into this space around 2014, what's going on in practice, I might have said probably not very much, but that's an entirely different story now. So my entry point into this topic was with the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement. And that was a state-led initiative established in 2012 that sought to understand what was already happening at that time. It was framed around disasters as a way of trying to capture a lot of different forms of environmental-related movement, but certainly was triggered by climate change. And one of the key outcomes of that initiative was the adoption of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, which has a very long title, which I'll spare you all, but which set out to sort of build consensus amongst states, but provide a bit of a roadmap as to how to address the issue. And actually, in thinking about this and then listening back to you talk about your book, I was thinking we had a lot of the same phrases about there not being a one-size-fits-all approach and so on. You know, it was very much about we can't just look to migration law, we can't look to refugee law. There's all of these different things that need to come, and the sort of the catchphrase, if you like, was that we need a toolbox approach, and we need to bring together different areas of law and policy, different arms of government, different actors, to do all sorts of different things, some of which was to facilitate mobility, but other things were like you're talking about, to help people stay in place, to adapt as long as they can, or to use mobility in a more limited way as well. So, you know, sometimes now people will travel for the dry season to stay with family, but they can return again. And so mobility is not always just that one-way thing. We have now, literally just in the last few years, some of the first sort of interstate agreements about how to cooperate on this particular issue. So the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility was adopted in 2023, and it very much sets out this approach. The different sections of that framework are called staying in place, migration, you know, in anticipation, protecting people who are displaced, planning relocation for areas that will become uninhabitable. In Africa, the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change was adopted in 2022, again talking about building climate resilience and so on. Just briefly within that, those frameworks, you know, some of the things that you've talked about already in terms of free movement agreements, bilateral agreements and so on, are put forward as potential tools in the box. And we have some good examples of those already in this region. I think probably if anyone in here has heard anything about climate mobility cooperation in the last year or two, it would be the Australian Tuvalu Fallipelli Union, which takes very much this adaptive mobility approach. One of the, so I'm sure you're aware, but the agreement provides 280 places per year permanent residency for Tuvaluans in Australia. One of the really striking features of that arrangement is that Tuvaluans do not have to move to Australia to benefit from that. So they can take up the permanent residency and stay in Tuvalu, which is such a nice example, a very rare example when it comes to mobility governance, of giving people that sort of flexibility. So I think some of those examples show where the idea of adaptive mobility has been picked up. There are still obviously concerns about does adaptive mobility always create positive adaptation? It's not just about can someone move, but the conditions under which they can move, the kind of rights and entitlements they have when they do. And of course, in this context, there's always, particularly, I suppose, outside the academic space, there's often this very big weighing up of what would we like to see in principle and what do we actually think is feasible in the current political climate, and given the various competing priorities in the world. One of the things that really struck me as not a climate change lawyer, but someone who's been working in this space for a while, was the really fantastic discussion in your book around common but different responsibilities. I think I'm messing it up. But this idea that the countries that have contributed the most to climate change owe it to those who contributed to the least to support, and mobility is one way that they can do that. On the flip side, I know in most of the conversations I've been in, we're usually trying to advocate for not really big solutions for very politically pragmatic reasons. We're not going to see a climate mobility treaty, and there might be various good reasons to not, but there's also this idea that smaller scale bilateral agreements or regional or even sub-regional frameworks like the free movement protocols, it's more feasible. You might actually get people to agree, but one of the things that it does is then geographically limit who's cooperating, who's feeding in, who's assisting. And so I wondered how does political feasibility come together with principle in this space? What are your thoughts on that? And are there ways to approach that in terms of advocacy that could be more helpful?
Yeah, thanks. You're not wrong that this is a big challenge, and I think it raises some really hard tensions. And I think some general ones first that we can set out, right? So when we're talking about what the law is or what the law should be, particularly when we're talking about human rights law, right? We know that the law is often not implemented in the way it should be, right? So you can sound like quite naive if you're saying this is what the law should be in this context, right? Particularly in our shrinking kind of political space that we have. At the same time, there's this tension where we have to be wary, I think, as scholars, legal scholars, as humans, I think, to not have a cynicism where we limit our arguments to what is possible. To say, well, this is the frame, the possibilities that we're working with. So what's like legal arguments in those spaces? Because then what happens is then you necessarily narrow your arguments, and then it becomes more and more narrow as that space shrinks. So we have to kind of grapple with this tension at the outset. So that's the first thing I would say, just in response. It's something that I think about a lot because I am making arguments about what the law is and what the law should be. And then I think more specifically to your point about things like regional agreements or bilateral, kind of free movement agreements and kind of the political feasibility, I think there's also a risk that when these things happen, the countries that I'm arguing have a differentiated responsibility that should be paying more. We'll just say, well, that's taken care of, right? And so I don't need to do anything more to this, right? And to that, I would say, well, actually, that's a real risk, and that's going to happen, irrespective of what we say about these obligations. It's already happening with the US, it's already happening, we can see it happening every day. But that doesn't change the fact, doesn't absolve in Australia, for example, of its international law obligations. And so that provides, I think, a point of leverage where we can actually use these legal arguments for different things, to hold states accountable, to make arguments, and to use it strategically. So getting ahead, maybe thinking about what the legal scholar can do. But I think it's really important to highlight that we need to navigate these tensions, but not be limited by the kind of political possibilities of today. And then I would also say that there's kind of a difference between these assistance obligations that I set out, which is incumbent on wealthy countries, and then cooperation, which is incumbent on all states. So there may need to be cooperation between developing countries when we're talking about shared ecosystems and managing them, or how we deal with migration, because migration doesn't necessarily or often go into the global north. It's usually crossing borders, in developing contexts. So I think it's a really good question. It's something that we're always having to remind ourselves, that kind of attention, what is possible, but also what we can not.
you've somewhat preempted the
Sorry.
next question.
I'm getting ahead of myself.
But also, you were just talking about human rights then, and as a bit of a treaty interpretation nerd, and I'm probably not alone in this group, I really appreciated the way that your book does draw different areas of law together. So climate change law and human rights in particular, but there's lots of others there. I was going to try and count the number of treaties that are listed in the table at the front. I didn't, but they run to pages. And I was thinking this, of course this is what we need. I mean, no one's going to argue that we don't need more coherence and integration in international law. But then I was thinking of the junior, climate change policy officer sitting at their desk, and the need for very complex solutions to cumulative problems, if you like, and the practical realities of working in this space. And what are your thoughts about how legal scholarship can contribute and best engage in a practical way to, if not bridge that principle and practice gap, at least sort of nudge it along?
Yeah, so I think this is something I wrestle with often, and it's kind of the question of why bother even write this book, right? Or why be a legal scholar at all, right? And I wasn't always an academic. So before I was an academic, I was actually an environmental litigator, and then I worked with environmental NGOs as well. And I think it's in part thinking about this in terms of a divisional labor, right? So climate change is a massive issue, and climate mobility itself is creating a lot of challenges, and no one single sector or field is going to solve it. And so there's going to be contributions across the field, right? So when I was in litigation, for example, I used legal arguments to best advocate for my client, right? And so maybe that was constrained necessarily by what the law is and by these strategies that were possible. When I was actually, years ago, I worked for an environmental NGO where we were even considering, should we even work on climate change, right? So we were thinking about that and what is our legal strategy? Because we're an advocacy group, right? We didn't really see one at the time, right? And so if those kind of creative arguments are there, that's what I see my role as a legal scholar, to give those tools, potential arguments for advocacy groups to go and say, okay, well, we have a strategy here that's possible. And we ultimately decided at that time that we would not pursue climate change, but they now have necessarily. And so I think as scholars, we have the opportunity of both time and ambition, right? So we have the time to think about these things, to make rigorous legal arguments, to make creative legal arguments that are not constrained by politics of our time, right? That doesn't necessarily have to think about things, whereas a government actor or an activist might make strategic choices, right? So it's a difference between strategy and possibility in terms of what the law should be, and okay, now I know what this person is saying, what the law is or what it should be. What do I do with that? What's best for my client? What can I do within the parameters of me as a government official and these kinds of things? So that's how I see my division of labor as my role right now.
And just to leave pragmatism entirely behind and exploit that opportunity and ambition we have in a room like this one, you say in the book that you work meticulously through climate change adaptation obligations and why they support your argument. But you also say that to implement these obligations fully would require a reconfiguration of the whole system. If we step into that space, what would that actually look like?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it, and I think back kind of I think that answer is not necessarily as satisfying as I would like. There's a lot I would want, but if I work within the framework of my book again, right? So I'm thinking about these 3 obligations, then I would think about what kind of system would enable the kinds of, for example, actions that states should take that I would think would be just and fair. And one of the things I argue for is that there is a right of participation in information, right? So then I set out concretely, what does that right look like? Participation, information, consent, agency. Now, if you pull that thread further, then we're starting to talk about self-determination. And if you pull that further, then we're talking about more democratic processes, and maybe we're talking about processes where the people who are affected by decisions are entirely in charge of planning for, implementing migration policies, their planned relocation. So that's kind of the ideal, I think, a system that enables that kind of participation in that decision making. Then when we're talking about assistance, I'm thinking more about, the fact that these kind of adaptation measures are fully funded, right? So that this is not something that may be the reality right now, because right now we see the adaptation measures and mitigation fighting for the same funding, right? Or we're talking about a loss and damage fund that may be coming at the expense of other kind of climate finance. So there's feels like a finite pot of money. But I guess my ideal would be a system where we're actually implementing these obligations where developed countries are paying their share, and then there would be money to do these kinds of things. And if you take that thread further, then we're maybe talking about other kinds of climate action. Maybe we're talking about, compensation and full reparations that are interacting with adaptation. Because I'm actually, my next work, I'm really interested in thinking about how these kinds of adaptation measures interact with demands for reparations, right? And then how they're kind of temporally synced or not, and thinking about the past and these kinds of things. And then finally, I guess would be the big question about cooperation, right? And I think that would look like something with probably a shift in kind of the balance of power that we have now, right? So that then brings in arguments about kind of the structures we have, maybe capitalism, things that go well beyond kind of the intrinsic arguments in my book, that I don't necessarily disagree with I'm saying. Only have so much space in that book.
It sounds like this won't be the last conversation as well, so maybe we can reconvene when the next book can Thank you again and congratulations.
Well, I feel like we could keep speaking for another couple of hours, but I think it is time to bring this event to a close. I would really like to thank our speakers so much. Beth and Lauren, you presented your books, which are really complex, but in such a clear and accessible manner. I'm sure we all agree, even those who haven't read the book learned so much. So thank you so much for that. And of course to Cameron and Tamara, your observations and insights were exceptional and provided some really interesting and thoughtful responses from our authors. And thank you to all of you for being here, for being engaged, for asking great questions. Thank you for those who are participating in the colloquium. I hope the remainder of your deliberations are wonderful. Thanks again for being here at Melbourne Law School, and once again, congratulations to our authors.